The sound of my own bones snapping would have been quieter than the lie my son told with his eyes. He didn't have to speak. The contempt was a physical force, a frigid wave rolling out of the warm house and striking me where I stood on the porch. My suitcase, a worn leather companion that had traveled with me through 50 years of life, landed on the glistening asphalt with a sickening, waterlogged thud. Rain, the relentless weeping rain of the Oregon coast, plastered my gray hair to my scalp and soaked through the thin wool of my sweater in seconds. At 68 years old, I was a burden, and my son Derek was taking out the trash. He stood in the doorway of the house I had helped him buy, arms crossed over a chest puffed with righteous indignation. His wife, Simone, hovered behind him, a pale ghost in beige cashmere, her face a mask of practiced sympathy that didn't quite reach her eyes. They didn't shout. They didn't have to. Their silence was a verdict, a final, unappealable judgment. My place in their world, the space I had occupied as a mother, a grandmother, a confidant, had been meticulously excised. The door clicked shut, not with a slam, but with a quiet finality that was somehow more brutal. That sound, a simple mechanical noise, became the punctuation mark at the end of my life as I had known it. I did not beg. Some fragment of pride, a shard of the woman I used to be, refused to allow it. I bent my aching knees, my hands trembling not just from the cold, but from a profound cellular shock, and lifted the handle of my soaked suitcase. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted down with more than just clothes and keepsakes. Each step away from that house was a squelch of my thin slippers against the pavement, a sound of utter defeat. I had no coat, no umbrella, just the sweater that had felt cozy 2 hours ago, now a cold, sodden skin. I walked until the streetlights blurred into hazy, weeping stars, and my legs felt like hollow reeds. I found myself under a highway overpass, the roar of trucks overhead, a monstrous heartbeat. A low concrete retaining wall offered a meager shelter, hidden from the main road, but not from the damp or the encroaching darkness. It wasn't safe, but it was invisible, and at that moment, invisibility felt like a blessing. I dragged the suitcase behind the wall, huddled against the cold, abrasive surface, and listened to the rhythmic hiss of tires slicing through standing water. A dull ache bloomed in my chest, a pain far deeper than the chill in my bones. It felt like my heart had turned to ash, a fine gray dust that settled in my lungs with every shallow breath. A few cars slowed, their headlights sweeping across my hiding place, but no one stopped. No one looked twice. To them, I was just another shadow, another piece of the city's forgotten landscape. The terror of that thought was worse than the cold. I wasn't Clara Hawthorne anymore. I was no one. Derek's voice echoed in my head, the single word he had used. Burden. He'd said it with such casual cruelty, as if discarding the woman who had kissed his scraped knees, who had sat up with him through fevers, who had poured every ounce of her love and energy into the foundation of his life, was nothing more than a simple, necessary chore. All those years, all those sacrifices, erased in the space of a single, stormy night. The wind grew teeth, gnawing at me through the wet wool. From my suitcase, I pulled a thin blanket, already damp and smelling of mildew. My body trembled uncontrollably, a violent shudder that was born of shame as much as cold. If you have ever given your entire world to someone, only to have them look at you as if you are nothing more than inconvenient clutter, then you know this feeling. It is the chilling realization that the love you gave was not a bond, but a resource they have simply finished consuming. I didn't sleep. I drifted in a haze of misery, listening to the city's mournful symphony of sirens and distant trains. Sometime after 3 a.m, as the rain softened to a miserable drizzle, I heard footsteps. They weren't hurried or heavy, but measured, deliberate, crunching on the wet gravel. I tensed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked up, expecting the worst, and for a disorienting moment, I thought the cold had finally conjured a hallucination. Veronica, my younger sister. Her chic black hair was plastered to her head, her mascara running in dark rivers down her cheeks, but her eyes, her fierce protective eyes, were fixed on me with an intensity that burned through the gloom. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year, not since a stupid fight about our parents' estate. A chasm of pride and stubbornness had opened between us. But there she was, standing under a grimy overpass in Port Blossom, Oregon, a 500-mile drive from her home in Arizona, looking like an avenging angel wrapped in a Burberry trench coat. She didn't speak at first. She simply knelt in the muck beside me, her expensive coat be damned, and brushed the wet strands of hair from my face. Her hand, warm and firm, closed over mine. It was the first moment of genuine human contact I had felt in what seemed like an eternity, and it was nearly my undoing. Without a word, she helped me to my feet, my joints screaming in protest. She lifted my waterlogged suitcase as if it weighed nothing and guided me toward a sleek rental car parked just out of sight. There was no judgment in her touch, no questions in her eyes. Only a simmering, controlled fury that was more comforting than any words could have been. In the warmth of the car, with the heater blasting and a thick blanket draped over my shoulders, I began to thaw. Ronnie handed me a thermos of hot cider that smelled of cinnamon and cloves. I took a sip, the sweet, spicy liquid a balm to my raw throat, and felt the first flicker of something other than despair. We drove in silence until we were on the highway, the city lights receding behind us. "You're coming home with me," she said, her voice flat and absolute. It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a decree. I could only nod, my throat too thick with unshed tears to speak. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. I think she saw the entire story in the way I clutched the thermos with both hands, as if it were a lifeline. The miles dissolved under the car's tires. I glanced at my sister, the determined set of her jaw illuminated by the dashboard lights. Veronica had always been fire where I was water. She raged and fought when she was wronged. I absorbed and endured. I had always believed endurance was a form of strength, a quiet resilience. But huddled in her car, stripped of everything I thought defined me, I began to wonder if surviving was the same as living. We stopped at a motel just outside the city limits. Ronnie handed me a keycard and a bag filled with new, dry clothes she must have bought on her frantic drive north. I stood under the scalding spray of the shower for a long time, scrubbing away the grime, the rain, and the biting humiliation. I stared at my reflection in the steam-fogged mirror, at the pale, hollowed-eyed stranger looking back at me, and then I slept. It was not a peaceful sleep, but it was in a bed, and it was safe. The next morning, when Ronnie said we were heading south, not to Arizona, but to a coastal town called Cannon Beach, I didn't ask why. I simply followed. A quiet, tectonic shift had occurred deep within me. It wasn't loud or sudden, but it was profound. It was the moment you realize that swallowing your pain to keep the peace is a fool's bargain. It's the moment you decide that this time you will not let it go. This time you will not be silent. If you have ever been treated like garbage by the people you love, if you have ever had to pull yourself up from the ground with nothing but shattered pride and aching bones, then you will understand what I did next, and it would not be pretty, but it would be just. The morning light was a pale, watery gray, filtering through the cheap motel curtains. Every muscle in my body protested as I sat up, the bed a landscape of unfamiliar lumps and scratchy sheets. But compared to the cold concrete, it was paradise. I was warm. I was safe. For now, that was enough. Ronnie was already dressed, moving with a crisp, efficient energy that filled the small room. She hadn't been sleeping. She'd been planning. "We need to go," she said, her tone leaving no room for discussion as she picked up my suitcase. I followed her out into the damp Oregon air, the scent of pine and wet earth a welcome change from the city's exhaust fumes. 10 minutes down the road, she pulled into a diner. She returned to the car with 2 steaming cups of coffee, a bag of pastries, and a thick manila folder. She handed me the folder first. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a professionally printed real estate listing for a 2-bedroom condominium in a new development in Cannon Beach, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. The photos showed floor-to-ceiling windows, a stone fireplace, and a wide balcony with an unobstructed view of the iconic Haystack Rock. The price listed at the bottom made my breath catch in my throat. I looked at her, my mind unable to form a coherent question. "It's yours," Ronnie said, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I closed on it this morning." I stared at her, then back at the folder, my mouth hanging slightly agape. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What? How?" "Arthur and I made an investment years ago," she explained, her voice even. "Tech stock. He never told you because he wanted it to be a surprise for your 70th birthday, a nest egg entirely separate from his pension. I've been managing it since he passed. The money was wired this morning. It's all in your name, Clara. No mortgage, no liens, no tricks." I numbly turned the page. Behind the listing was a bank statement for a newly opened savings account. The number printed on the page was so large it seemed unreal. $5 million. My ears began to ring, a high, piercing sound that drowned out the noise of the road. The folder felt impossibly heavy in my lap, the coffee forgotten. The numbers on the page refused to make sense, a string of zeros that belonged to another person, another life. Ronnie pulled the car back onto the highway. We drove in silence for a long time, the dramatic, craggy landscape of the Oregon coast scrolling past the window. Nothing felt real. A strange mix of vertigo and a terrifying, unfamiliar sense of power washed over me. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something heavier, a responsibility I didn't know how to carry. We soon turned off the main highway and onto a private, winding road lined with majestic Sitka spruce. An elegant iron gate slid open as Ronnie entered a code. A uniformed guard offered a polite nod as we passed. The building was stunning, a modern design of cedar, glass, and stone that seemed to grow organically from the cliffside. Ronnie parked in a reserved space marked 4B. She retrieved my suitcase and led the way into a lobby that smelled of sea salt and cedar. The elevator ascended in silence. On the 4th floor, Ronnie unlocked a heavy oak door and pushed it open. The space was flooded with natural light. The walls were a soft, warm white, the furniture a tasteful mix of modern comfort and rustic elegance, but I barely saw any of it. I was drawn, as if by a magnetic force, to the wall of glass at the far end of the room. I stepped out onto the balcony and gripped the cool metal railing. Below me the Pacific Ocean churned, a vast expanse of gray and blue, its raw power a thunderous, living roar. Ronnie placed my suitcase by the door. "This is your home now," she said, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years. "And I'm in 4A, right across the hall. I'm staying for as long as it takes, so don't get any ideas about disappearing on me." I turned, my hands still gripping the railing. "Thank you," felt like such a small, inadequate phrase for the monumental shift she had just orchestrated in my universe. I settled for a slow, deliberate nod. Ronnie's expression hardened again. "I know what he did, Clara. I know what they've been doing. You don't have to talk about it. But you will not let them take anything else from you. Not one more thing, not ever again." She met my gaze, her eyes blazing. "This place is yours, the money is yours, and I've already spoken to Isabel." The name jolted me. Isabel Sterling. Ronnie's old law school roommate, a brilliant, notoriously ruthless corporate attorney in Portland. I hadn't seen her in decades. "Isabel is drafting the paperwork now," Ronnie continued. "Trusts, financial shields, everything. Whatever you want protected will be sealed in a vault of legalese so tight not even light could get in. They thought they could bury you, Clara. They thought shame and poverty would keep you silent. A long, slow breath escaped my lips. My fingers tightened on the railing until my knuckles were white. "You are not a guest here," Ronnie said, her voice a steel blade. "You're not a dependent. You are the owner of this home. And it's time you started acting like it." I stood on that balcony long after she had gone, the wild, salt-laced wind whipping at my face. The ocean was a constant, powerful churn, mirroring the turmoil in my own mind. Derek and Simone thought they had cast me into a storm, leaving me to drown quietly in some forgotten corner of the world. They had no idea. I wasn't in the storm anymore. I was the storm, and I was about to make landfall. 3 days after I moved into the clifftop sanctuary, Ronnie organized a small welcome to the building gathering in the residence lounge. She didn't ask. She informed me via text, telling me the time and instructing me to wear a new blue cashmere sweater set she had purchased and left hanging in my closet. I arrived a few minutes past 6, the lounge aglow with soft lighting and filled with the gentle hum of conversation. Through a panoramic window, the sun was setting over the ocean, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple. There were perhaps a dozen other residents, mostly retired professionals who greeted me with a polite, reserved warmth that didn't pry. Ronnie stayed close, introducing me simply as her sister, Clara Hawthorne, who had come to the coast for a change of pace. Her tone was a masterclass in setting boundaries, offering just enough information to be gracious while building an invisible wall around my personal life. No one knew the truth of my arrival, and for that, I was grateful. While Ronnie mingled, I found a quiet spot near the window, content to watch the light fade. I didn't want to make small talk or invent a plausible history for myself. It was enough to be present, to be safe, to be surrounded by people who saw me not as a burden, but as a new neighbor. My fragile peace was shattered when the building's head of security, a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and military straight posture named Frank, entered the lounge. He did a slow, professional sweep of the room before his eyes landed on me. He ambled over, nodding politely. "Unit 4B, he said, glancing at the name tag Ronnie had insisted I wear. "Right across from Ms. Vance. She's a sharp one. You've got a good woman watching your back." I agreed with a small smile. He lowered his voice slightly. "Just a heads up, ma'am. We had a report of a car that didn't belong parked down by the mailboxes for a couple of hours late last night. Nothing came of it, but we're keeping an eye out." A knot of ice formed in my stomach. I thanked him, making a mental note to tell Ronnie, though I suspected she already knew. Her vigilance was absolute. A few minutes later, Ronnie tapped a spoon against her wine glass, calling the room to a brief moment of quiet. She raised her glass in a short, simple toast. "To my sister Clara," she said, her voice clear and strong, "and to second chances. They are always worth celebrating." As the polite applause faded and conversations resumed, I saw Ronnie's eyes flick towards the lounge entrance. She had seen it open before I did. I turned, and my blood ran cold. Derek and Simone stood there, framed in the doorway, radiating an aura of entitled confidence. He wore a crisp dress shirt, and she was draped in shades of cream and gold, her smile as bright and artificial as a plastic flower. They looked as if they had received a personal invitation. My stomach clenched violently. Ronnie, without a word, moved to intercept them. I couldn't hear their hushed exchange, but her posture was an unbreachable wall. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't making a scene, but the sheer force of her will was palpable even from across the room. Derek tried to look over her shoulder at me, that same practiced, charming smile plastered on his face, as if he hadn't hurled my life onto a wet street just days ago. I stood frozen, my hand gripping the edge of a dessert table so hard my knuckles ached. Ronnie motioned discreetly to Frank, the security guard, who approached with a calm authority. The conversation was brief. After a moment of defiant stillness, Derek and Simone turned and walked out. Simone didn't even grant me a backward glance. The rhythm of the party slowly returned, but the air was different now, tainted. Ronnie came back to my side, plucked a strawberry from a tray, and said calmly, "I knew they'd try something." She'd seen a vague but pointed comment on social media from one of Simone's friends, a mention of a new family property on the Oregon coast. Ronnie was always 3 steps ahead. After the gathering, she walked me back to my apartment. At my door, she paused. "They didn't come to apologize, Clara. They came to scout the territory. They came to see what you have." I nodded, the truth of her words settling heavily in my chest. I went inside, but I didn't feel safe enough to rest. I sat on the edge of my new sofa, the sound of the ocean a distant roar, and waited for the adrenaline to subside. They knew where I was. They knew I wasn't broken and destitute under a bridge. They knew I had resources, and they would be back. I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a drawer in the elegant writing desk by the window and took out a new leather-bound journal Ronnie had left for me. I clicked open a pen, and across the top of the first clean page, I wrote a single sentence. "What they took from me, they will return." Underneath, I drew a line and wrote 3 words: dignity, security, legacy. The curtain had just gone up on the second act. They thought they were still directing the play. But I was the one holding the script now, and I was about to rewrite the ending. Ronnie was a creature of decisive action. 2 days after Derek and Simone's unwelcome appearance, she arrived at my door at 10 a.m. Sharp, a stack of folders in one arm and a tablet in the other. Her expression was all business. "They're coming again," she stated, spreading the documents across my granite kitchen island. "Not with fake smiles this time. They're going legal." She laid out the evidence she had already gathered. A quiet, ruthlessly efficient private investigator she'd hired had been tracking Derek and Simone's digital footprints. The trail was subtle, but damning. Derek had made inquiries with an out-of-state law firm specializing in elder asset management. Simone had been messaging a mobile notary on a local networking site. "They're going to come at you with paperwork that looks official, probably delivered by hand to seem personal," Ronnie explained, tapping a printed email. "They think you're still the same soft-hearted woman who will sign anything to avoid a conflict, especially if they show up crying." She looked at me, her gaze unwavering. "I need you to be ready to do exactly as I say." I agreed without hesitation. The last vestiges of the meek, accommodating woman I once was had been washed away in that storm. This wasn't a family squabble. It was a siege, and they had underestimated my defenses. That afternoon, following Ronnie's precise instructions, I invited a few of my new neighbors over for coffee and pastries. It was a casual affair, designed to have witnesses present without appearing like a setup. Ronnie instructed the front gate to allow Derek and Simone entry if they arrived, ensuring they wouldn't be turned away. Then, she discreetly placed a small, high-fidelity audio recorder under the lamp on the end table and settled into an armchair, the picture of serene hospitality. They arrived less than an hour later. I opened the door to Derek's carefully rehearsed, apologetic smile. Simone stood behind him, clutching a gift bag from which a bottle of expensive wine peeked out. They entered with loud, cheerful greetings, making a show of being surprised and delighted to see I had company. After a few minutes of excruciatingly shallow small talk, Derek leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Mom, I brought something I hope you'll look at," he said, his voice laced with false sincerity. He pulled a neatly stapled document from his briefcase. The cover page read, in bold letters, "Family Wellness and Property Agreement." Ronnie, without moving from her chair, simply arched an eyebrow. Derek slid the papers across the coffee table towards me. "It's just something to make things smoother," he explained, "so we can help out, coordinate your medical care, make sure you're looked after, if anything urgent comes up. I picked up the document. It was 6 pages of dense legalese, but halfway through, I found the venom, a clause labeled Temporary Power of Authorization, and another titled Financial Oversight Mandate. The language was couched in terms of care and assistance, but its intent was clear. It would grant Derek full legal authority over all my medical and financial decisions. I set the papers down without a word. Ronnie stood, walked to the kitchen counter, and retrieved a second folder. From it, she produced a nearly identical document, this one with a red line scored through the middle. "This is a copy of the draft you commissioned last week from that paralegal in Portland," she said, her voice dangerously calm as she addressed Derek. "The email exchanges are all time-stamped. The language is a word-for-word match." The color drained from Derek's face. Simone froze, her hand halfway to her teacup. Ronnie turned to me. "Go on, Clara. Ask them what this is really for." I didn't have to. The suffocating silence in the room was answer enough. Ronnie nonchalantly tapped her tablet, activating the recording app in plain sight. Then she raised her voice, just enough for the neighbors to hear clearly. "I want everyone in this room to understand," she announced, "that this document was designed to legally strip my sister of her financial independence under the fraudulent guise of family concern. This is what elder abuse looks like." Derek shot to his feet. "You're twisting things. We're trying to help." Ronnie let out a short, sharp laugh. "No, Derek, I understand perfectly. And so does the state of Oregon. And I have a feeling the Bar Association will be very interested in the ethics of an attorney who drafts such a predatory document." Her words hung in the air like smoke. She gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I stood up, walked to the coffee table, picked up the contract they had brought, and with a slow, deliberate motion, tore it in half, then in half again. The room fell utterly silent. Our neighbors stared, their polite smiles gone. Derek looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Raw, undiluted fear, not of his mother, but of the consequences. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held up the torn pieces of paper. "This," I said, my voice steady and clear, "is what happens when you mistake a quiet woman for a weak one." Ronnie gestured toward the door. Humiliated and exposed, Derek and Simone made a hasty exit, not looking back. When the room was empty again, save for the two of us, Ronnie brought me a glass of water. "They'll try something else," she said softly. I nodded. I knew they would, but they didn't know that the game had changed. We were no longer on the defensive. We were building a case, piece by piece, lie by lie. And the next time they came for me, they would find not a victim, but a fortress. And it was a fortress they themselves had taught me to build. Their tactics shifted from aggression to a cloying, insincere sweetness. The morning after the disastrous coffee gathering, I found a single white orchid on my doormat. No note, just a perfect, pristine flower, a silent apology from someone who lacked the courage to speak. I left it there to wilt. The next evening, Derek appeared, holding a bag from a local Italian restaurant. He stood outside the security screen, telling me I looked well, that he missed me, that he and Simone felt terrible about the misunderstanding. I listened without expression, my hand resting near a small recording device Ronnie had installed by the door. I said nothing. He eventually left the food on the bench outside and departed. The next day it was Simone, bearing a stack of magazines and a loaf of homemade banana bread. She didn't mention the contract. She just chattered about wanting to help with errands, about how she was worried I was all alone. She even called me Mom, a title she hadn't used in years. A week passed in this strange rhythm of unsolicited gifts and hollow pleasantries. They were probing for a weakness, a crack in the wall. I gave them nothing but polite, impenetrable silence. Meanwhile, Ronnie and Isabel were working. Isabel, with a few quiet calls to contacts in the banking industry, discovered that Derek had attempted to have my bank correspondence redirected to his address, using old information to bypass security questions. The request had been flagged and denied, but it was a clear sign of their intent. The night we learned this, the fire alarm on my floor blared at 2 a.m. It was a false alarm, a pulled lever in the service corridor. Security footage showed a blurry figure in a jacket identical to the one Derek had worn to the party. Isabel advised we escalate our defenses. She walked me through setting up multi-factor authentication on all my accounts and placed digital alerts that would notify us of any access attempt from any device, anywhere in the world. They were trying to build a narrative that I was becoming forgetful and incompetent. 2 days later, a slick young man in a collared shirt knocked on my door, claiming to be from an elder estate planning group sent by my family. I told him I already had legal representation and closed the door in his face. Isabel filed a formal complaint with the state's Adult Protective Services Division, not to press charges, but to create an official paper trail of harassment. They were trying to make me look vulnerable. So I sat at my kitchen table, spread out the new deed to my home, the statements for my accounts, and the charter for the trust Isabel had established. I ran my fingers over my name, printed in crisp black ink. Clara Hawthorne, owner, trustee. They wanted to prove I couldn't manage, but with every move they made, they were only proving how necessary my independence truly was. The final desperate attempt at manipulation came on a Tuesday afternoon. Derek appeared alone, his face a mask of weary sincerity. I let him in, the recorder under the counter silently capturing everything. He sat on the edge of the sofa, his posture radiating defeat. "I know we messed up," he began, his voice low. "We're not here to fight anymore. We're here to fix this. I don't want your money, Mom. I just want peace." I watched him, my expression unreadable. "I just think," he continued, shifting his tone to one of gentle reason, "it makes sense to have someone on file. An emergency contact. Someone who can make a decision if you can't." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin, pale blue folder. "It's nothing financial. Just lets us be listed so we can help." This was it. The end game. The Trojan horse. I looked at the folder, then walked to the balcony and pulled back the curtain. Down in the parking lot, Simone was leaning against their car, talking animatedly on her phone. He had lied. She wasn't downstairs. She was coordinating. I let the curtain fall. I picked up his folder, walked into the kitchen, and dropped it directly into the trash can. When I returned, Derek was on his feet, his mask of concern finally slipping. "Vivian really did a number on you," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "Veronica didn't do this," I said, my voice quiet but hard as stone. "You did." I opened the front door and waited. He stalked out without another word. I locked the door behind him and turned off the recorder. 2 days later, Isabel had the entire conversation transcribed. It was added to a growing file, a meticulous timeline of coercion and deceit. We now had irrefutable proof. The next time they came for me, they would not be met with silence. They would be met with the full, unyielding force of the law. The envelope that slid under my door was not a peace offering. It was a declaration of war. It was a formal notice of intent to file for conservatorship, drafted by a lawyer whose name I didn't recognize. The 6 pages were a symphony of carefully crafted lies, alleging erratic financial decisions, evidence of mental decline, and vulnerability to undue influence. They were officially attempting to have me declared incompetent. They were trying to use the very fortress Ronnie had built for me as proof that I was being manipulated. I didn't cry. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed in the quiet apartment. Then I called Isabel. The legal battle that followed was swift and brutal. Their case was built on a foundation of sand. Isabel responded not with a defense, but with a devastating counteroffensive. She presented the audio recordings of Derek's manipulative visits, the security logs of their harassment, the complaint filed with Adult Protective Services, and the sworn affidavits from my old neighbors who testified to the night they had thrown me out. To counter their claims of my incompetence, I underwent a full cognitive and neurological evaluation with a leading specialist in Portland. The results were not just good, they were exceptional. I sent a notarized copy of the report directly to their lawyer. Their final fatal error was an act of pure, arrogant desperation. They submitted a forged document to the court, a supposed amendment to my trust that granted Derek co-signing authority. It was a sloppy, amateurish forgery, and it was their undoing. Isabel's forensic document examiner identified it as fraudulent within hours. The notary whose signature they had faked provided a sworn statement that he had never met me nor witnessed any such document. The hearing was a formality. In a sterile courtroom, under the flat, fluorescent lights, I watched as their web of lies collapsed under the weight of concrete evidence. The judge dismissed their petition with a scathing rebuke, citing a disturbing pattern of predatory behavior. But he didn't stop there. He referred the entire case, including the evidence of forgery and perjury, to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. I met Derek's eyes across the courtroom just once. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. He finally understood. I was not a frail old woman to be managed and controlled. I was a survivor. On the courthouse steps, in the bright, cleansing sunlight, he approached me. "You're really going to do this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, Derek," I said, my voice devoid of heat or malice, only a profound and weary finality. "You did this to yourself." I turned and walked away, Ronnie at my side without looking back. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of their actions unfolded. Derek and Simone were formally charged with forgery, attempted fraud, and perjury. Their carefully constructed lives began to crumble. Their story became a cautionary tale in the local news, their names synonymous with a particularly ugly brand of familial greed. I, on the other hand, began to build. The trust Isabel had formed was converted into a formal nonprofit, the Hawthorne Foundation for Second Chances. Its mission was to provide grants, legal aid, and housing assistance to elderly individuals facing abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation. The condominium, the savings, the assets they had tried to steal became the seed capital for a legacy of protection and empowerment. I never spoke to Derek again. There was no tearful reconciliation, no deathbed forgiveness. Some wounds are too deep to be mended, some betrayals too fundamental to be absolved. My healing came not from forgiving him, but from rendering him irrelevant to my life and my future. My story became a source of strength for others. I hosted workshops, shared my experiences, and worked to change the laws that left so many vulnerable. My sister Ronnie became the Foundation's fierce and brilliant board chair. Isabel Sterling offered her firm's services pro bono. We built a new family, one forged not by blood, but by a shared commitment to justice and dignity. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I stand on my balcony and watch the relentless waves of the Pacific crash against the rocks below. The storm that once tried to destroy me now feels like a distant memory. It did not break me. It washed me clean. It revealed the bedrock of strength I never knew I possessed. They thought my story was over, a quiet fade into insignificance. But they were wrong. It was just the beginning. For it is often in the harshest winters of our lives that we are forced to plant the seeds of our most magnificent spring, building a legacy, not of what was taken, but of what we chose to grow in its place.